Welcome to In the Loop, a podcast by Civic Duty Rice. My name is Rémy Slimp, a freshman at Hansen.
And I'm Sonia Torres, a junior from Hansen.
Today we'll be discussing the oil economy and how it affects Houstonites, and particularly Rice students. Today we are lucky that we have two econ majors in the audio room, so we decided it would be a great time to discuss something that affects the pricing of literally everything you own, the oil economy. In researching this episode, we had a very difficult time getting everything digested and just figuring out all the important factors of this topic. For example, how does U.S. oil consumption affect the U.S. economy? How does our dependence on foreign oil affect Houston and the main businesses driving our city economy? We hope we can answer some of these questions today.
But first, a little bit of economics knowledge. The value of global currencies can be currently determined by two types of mechanisms, either a fixed rate or the floating exchange rate. And this is pretty important because it determines how much, basically, bang for your buck you can get. To explain this a little bit further, fixed rate currencies, which tie a currency's value to gold or to another country's valuation, like Saudi Arabia does with the US dollar, basically means that the value of a particular currency is based off of that other thing's value as well. And it fluctuates much less than another floating exchange rate fiated currency would. In contrast, floating exchange rate currencies, which include currencies such as the ruble, the pound, the peso, and dollar currencies, are valued, for instance, through indices such as the US dollar index. This is a pretty complicated process, but basically a bunch of factors like the strength of each country's economy and interest rates determine the value of the dollar in comparison to other countries. What this means is that traders will come to foreign exchange rate markets, will look at each other, imagine person A representing the US, person B representing Mexico, and they come to the table and they're like, here's our interest rate, here's how our economy's doing, and on a daily basis, determine the ratio for each currency.
So with this basic knowledge and understanding of how economics work, let's move to the present day. Back in December, Aramco, for those of you who don't know, which is probably a lot, not gonna lie, is the Saudi Arabian oil company. Aramco is sort of an acronym for that. Back in December, they had initial conversations with Tellurian Incorporated, which is a Houston-based natural gas developer, basically to try to see about having a stake in Tellurian or possibly acquiring assets or doing business deals in the future. And why that is so important is because this contrasts heavily with 20 years of history of dependency on oil, especially from countries like Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries.
Absolutely. I mean, It's crazy that forever we've had the U.S. positioned in a way that it always had to invest in other places, and most of our oil production that happens in the U.S. is through U.S. investment, and for that switch to happen is very, very different from the usual trend that we've seen in the U.S. participating in the global oil market. And I think this also correlates with the U.S. energy boom that we saw in 2017, where we saw shale output surge over 10 million barrels a day. We also saw Chevron and ExxonMobil shifting their revenue investments back to the U.S., which again, first of all, correlates with this investment by Aramco, but also expands on it because it means that it's not just other oil players that are now realizing, the U.S. is a player in this, but the U.S. itself is coming back and investing in its own oil production. And I think that's both going to impact our level of dependency on other people that provide oil for us. And secondly, it's going to definitely shift the way that the U.S. acts in terms of a foreign policy actor.
So on top of everything else we've mentioned, Saudi Arabia has announced it is initiating reforms intended to, quote-unquote, end its addiction to oil. This program is essentially designed to curb oil production within Saudi Arabia, which has other effects within other OPEC countries, such as trying to help allies that are struggling a bit in their production and helping them to sort of boost their economy by limiting their production. But what this essentially means for Saudi Arabia is that in curbing their production to become less dependent on oil, it allows the United States to become less dependent on Saudi Arabia's influence. Combined with our boost in shale oil, we become a lot less dependent on Saudi Arabia for making decisions with a huge global impact. This also applies to other nations that may have had a reliance on Saudi Arabia before this decision was made by Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So what does this mean, though, for Houston and for students at Rice? And for this, we actually have a special guest today. Our guest today, Donald Anderson, is connecting to us via phone interview. Mr. Anderson is the Chief Financial Officer and partner in charge of the Houston office of TD International, which is a strategic intelligence and advisory firm based in Washington, D.C. He is also a Jones Business School grad, so he has ties here in Houston, and he'll provide a great insight as to how international markets and strategic intelligence expertise frame our understanding of the oil economy and how it is relevant to Rice and Houston. So, Mr. Anderson, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Rémy. I'm glad to help out.
All right. Let's just get right to it. How does the oil industry and oil money affect Rice students?
So I think it's important to realize that Rice University has the privilege of being located in the energy capital of the world, and the Houston and the greater Houston area benefits considerably from the fact that global energy business is focused on the city, and so you have activity from oil and gas companies and oil and gas countries wanting to be and have a presence in Houston and do business in Houston. That brings tax dollars to the city, which translates to great infrastructure and opportunities for Rice University and exposure for Rice on the international stage. For the Rice students, you create awareness of the university that leads to a diversity of the population, where you have kids from Saudi Arabia are aware of Rice University because of the location of Rice in the energy capital of the world, and they want to be here. They know the research that's being funded by energy companies and energy companies and service companies and all the secondary industries that exist because Rice is located in the energy capital of the world. The research dollars and the employment opportunities is a great attraction to students wanting to come to Rice for both undergraduate and graduate studies. And so, it's a great coupling of a wonderful university and a great city that happens to be the energy capital of the world. And so, it's a great bonus for Rice in terms of the impact on Rice's brand, as well as the opportunities for students in terms of research, curriculum, and then employment opportunities once they graduate.
All right, thank you for that. Now, this is a question that some might bring up, knowing some of the environmentally based controversies surrounding the oil industry. Do you think there is a need for our city to move away from an oil-dependent economy?
I think, I would say that it's something that the city has already been doing in many respects, just naturally because of the fluctuation in the oil and gas, the fluctuation in the oil and gas economy. So, being in Houston, the oil and gas industry has always been kind of that barometer of how the city is doing. But over time, the infrastructure built around the oil and gas industry, all those service companies, the accounting firms, the engineering firms, the technology firms, as we go through the traditional business cycles, the commodity business cycles of oil and gas, during those down periods, many of those companies don't go away. They stay here. And so what you find is they have diversified. So a lot of the technology companies that service the oil and gas industry during a down commodity price period, they adapt and they service the healthcare industry or other industries located in Houston. And so what we've had is a natural diversity that's occurred in the Houston economy that's been cataloged by groups like the Greater Houston Partnership, where we see that Houston has naturally diversified itself in many ways because of the boom and bust cycle that you have in oil and gas. And so it's of course, it's going back to your question, it's smart that Houston have a diversified economy. And I think what you see is we have become more diversified because of the nature of the oil and gas industry. Like, if you look at Houston 1980 and the diversity of the city and the economy, 30 years ago, it's changed greatly. And even if you look in the last 5 to 10 years, some of the boom bust in oil and gas that we've seen, the city, the economy has changed and adapted. And then when oil comes back, the city is actually we're ready and prepared, and we service the energy industry, and we just become better for it. I think a lot of the population growth that we've seen in the city has come because of the fact that our economy is no longer strictly an oil and gas economy. It's much more diversified. And so I would think that diversification is good, and it will continue just because of the natural boom and bust cycle of oil and gas.
So one more question that I have, Mr. Anderson. You talked a lot about, like, I guess some of the ties that Rice would have basically to, like, the brand, and how international attention to the brand would expand Rice. Do you think that there are, like, philanthropic ties to oil money as well? And do you think that could also be a beneficial factor to Rice?
That's a great question, Ray. And Rice has benefited from both on the individual perspective as well as the corporate perspective, philanthropy from corporations, individuals to support programs at Rice University, like conferences. There's a conference next week that's on. It's the Oil and Gas Conference on Computing, I believe. And there are research assistantships, scholarships that are sponsored by oil and gas companies, and also by individuals who have made their wealth from oil and gas. And so a lot of oil and gas individuals and corporations have, they continue to play it forward, and Rice is a beneficiary of their donations, and the students benefit from that because it's increased opportunities for research assistantships and also adjunct professors from industry that come in and share their knowledge. And that, unlike any other school in the country, has that opportunity, and it's because where Rice University is located.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your insight. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. But yeah, thank you for coming in and sharing your wisdom with us, Mr. Anderson.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ray.
So the future's looking bright for Houston, it seems like, from the conversation we had with Mr. Anderson. What is key to take away from this is that oil interests are very complicated. Geopolitics are very complicated. Our finances across the world also make it more complicated. But all of this stuff is very important. And if you spend a little bit more time after you listen to this podcast, following some of the links that we'll attach below, we think that this will be helpful and informative in the way that you make personal choices in regards to your consumption, in regards to even who you vote for. So that takes us to our call to action. The first thing is awareness. We realize that all of these topics, unless you have an economics background, and even for us, it was frankly kind of difficult, right, Rémy?
Yeah, we have a lot of meat in basically in the script and in sort of like trying to just piece this incredibly complex puzzle together was difficult.
Absolutely, and I think for a lot of us, that can mean that we become apathetic about the way that the U.S. is acting, what is driving and motivating our foreign policy. But that's exactly when we should bite back. Read an article a day, read an article a week. Ask people who are know more about this issue and become an expert yourself. The idea here is that don't trust this, or I start sounding like a conspiracy theorist, but more like trust your own instinct and your intellect in participating in the way that United States citizens understand their own government, and understanding how the oil economy plays into both our city's interests, particularly as Houstonites, is very important. So the first thing's awareness. Become more knowledgeable about this issue so that you can understand how that impacts your pricing, your gas prices, your consumption, and other actions taken by your elected leaders.
Another bonus is that when you become more informed about a topic, you can tell who is not more informed.
Absolutely. And that brings me to the second point, which is personal choices. When you know about this stuff, you can make very selective choices about what type of car you're going to buy, what type of energy you're going to buy. Whenever you go OC and you decide, hey, am I going to be supporting this area or this electricity company that has more renewable options for me, or is more environmentally friendly, or is that not something I care about? Or alternatively, am I very interested in maintaining Houston's powerhouse and power hold on the oil economy, and therefore do I want to support more fossil fuels? Whatever choice you end up deciding, I think that needs to be informed by a knowledge and an understanding of how oil across the world impacts U.S. and Houston interests. And that takes me to the third point, which is a lot of our elected officials, first, particularly in Houston, have ties with a lot of the big companies, Chevron, ExxonMobil, etc. And a lot of the decisions, particularly as they relate to the economy, trade, and especially environmental policy, are affected by their viewpoints on this. So it's very important that you become aware, because then that impacts who you're voting for. It aligns not just with party politics, but it aligns with particular people within the party, because someone who is very likely to defend fracking in the Arctic is not going to be the person that you want to vote for in terms of an environmentally friendly politician, and vice versa. So that will definitely play out and impact the way that you make and inform your voting decisions. That's it for us today. These are some of the ways that you can become more involved in this issue. Thank you for listening, and please leave comments and join the conversation. We try to be unbiased here, but we can't truly get all the perspectives without you, our listeners.
Thank you very much.